Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video I'm just going to run you through the basics of the Malaya campaign game which is part of the Pacific Battles series by Decision Games. So this was the one I talked about briefly in my introduction earlier, and we're just looking at the main map here. I'm standing on the British and Commonwealth side, and the Japanese player would normally sit opposite, with the map of the peninsula between them. Now, victory in this game is fairly straightforward. There are certain towns of a strategic importance, such as Kotabaru over there, Grik over here, Kuala Lumpur here, obviously. All of these are marked with a yellow star. If at any point the Japanese control all of the yellow starred sectors, they win the game. The last three are, of course, the strategic locations on Singapore Island over there. The British win by preventing this or by wiping out all Japanese infantry units, in effect securing an end of turn where the Japanese have no effective fighting forces left. The game follows a fairly standard and well-worn I go, you go pattern. So one player who has the initiative, at the beginning of the game it's always the Japanese, but it may switch over to the British and Commonwealth as play progresses. They go through various stages. So initially one draws campaign markers from a cup. Now the Commonwealth start with Force Z, which is both a marker and a bombardment force. It can be attacked by the Japanese, obviously. Prince of Wales and Repulse can be lost. Other examples include Intel, Abda reinforcements. So these represent random events that may change the course of a turn or introduce a bonus or introduce a penalty. A good example is Abda reinforcements. If this is drawn at the beginning of the Commonwealth player's turn, they have to roll a dice. A positive result means they get reinforcements. A negative means that Malaya Command has to give up some of its ground and air assets in order that they may be redeployed elsewhere. That's bad news. The Japanese have their own equivalent. So, for example, they have this one is staff planning, which allows them to conduct movement and attacks without the need for supplies. And of course, the Japanese side wouldn't feel complete without the banzai option. Now, that is a very powerful counter. It allows the Japanese to attack at an enhanced strength, but if they suffer a draw or a loss in that action, their casualties are doubled. So it is a dangerous thing to play with, both for the wielder and for his intended victim. So that's the first phase of the turn. Next comes the logistics phase, where first the initiative and then the non-initiative player get their supply together, calculate what their reinforcements are for the turn. Reinforcements can be delayed by enemy air attacks on the previous turn. One curious feature of this game is that, unlike many other games I have on this campaign, tracing lines of supply is meaningless. Now, that is a strange thing because a huge part of the historical Malaya campaign was the Japanese success in hooking around behind the British defenders and cutting their road networks and forcing them to withdraw or simply to scatter from lack of supplies. That doesn't feature so much in this game. Both sides seem to have a fair amount of sea transport, and as long as the ports on the western coast remain open, trapped British units can remain resupplied for, well, as long as the Japanese don't interdict them by air. It's a strange mechanic and one I'm having a bit of difficulty getting my head round. But there it is. It presents a slightly different perspective on this campaign, I suppose. Next come the movement and combat phases. There are four altogether. Phasing or initiative player moves first, conducts his attacks and his bombardments before then. Defending player then moves, assigns bombardments, conducts attacks, and then the process is repeated again for both sides. except that the second phase ones can only the second phase can only see the movement of units that are within range of an activated headquarters. Now, activated headquarters are those that have been switched on, as it were, by the use of supply. I'm going to zoom in on a portion of the map so you can see how this works. So the rating of the units in this game is fairly straightforward. Whether they are headquarters, supply, or infantry, or indeed any other arm, the ratings are always in the same format. So in the case of this unit here, 12th Infantry, 4 is their attack strength, 6 is their defense, and 6 in blue is their movement rating. So in order to function in any capacity, they have to be within command range of a headquarters unit. That's these fellows. That number there near my thumbnail is the command radius for the headquarters. So any units within a 2 hex range of that headquarters can be given orders, can move, can conduct combat. They can only receive these orders from a headquarters that has been activated. And you can only activate a headquarter by expending supply at the beginning of your turn. So that denotes there are 2 supply points available on this unit. So you would burn one at the start of your phase, not literally, activate the headquarters, and it would not only be able to order these units to move and attack, but it would also be able to move itself. Now, headquarters can never attack, they can only defend themselves. But that number in brackets is how much they add by way of a positive column shift to an attack. So this is actually quite a straightforward game. There's not a lot here that wargamers will fail to recognize. In addition to the helpful reinforcement charts, there's also combat results tables for both raids and assaults. So naturally, these are a bit less damaging than those, but those achieve more by way of results. They're more decisive. You do have to work out odds differentials for your attacking force, modified, of course, by terrain. We have different types of terrain, and we have a terrain effects chart. And each turn proceeds in that manner until you have played 6 turns. This is not a long game once you get the hang of it. The turns can take a while because there's a lot of thinking that has to go on. As you can see from this close view of the map, the Japanese have many, many options for how they might pursue a conquest of the Malay Peninsula. They could either amphibiously hop from north to south, or they can take advantage of Malaya's fairly extensive road and rail network. But they always have to be aware that the clock is ticking. And right from the get-go, Singapore is heavily defended. Now, the flip side to this is Commonwealth units are no great shakes at jungle fighting. Japanese units extend zones of control which inhibit enemy movement. Commonwealth units do this as well, but in very limited fashion. Your average Commonwealth unit does not exert a zone of control into a jungle hex, meaning that in patches of jungle, these green areas, the Japanese can infiltrate and filter past them relatively easily. The other problem the British have, and bearing in mind the 28th Indian is one of the better British units, that's a British brigade. Japanese regiments have a much higher offensive and mobility rating, reflecting their better overall preparedness and also a slight advantage in jungle craft. The Japanese also turn up with more aircraft, which can make life very problematic for the British. So in that sense, they're fairly evenly balanced. But the Japanese do have to be aware of the time factor, and to a degree, so do the Commonwealth. They have the advantage of sitting on most of the objective hexes at the beginning of the game, but that is not something that you can necessarily count on to secure you a decisive win. The only other thing I might mention in this game is that combat, as I've discovered from the games I've played so far, is extremely bloody. If you throw in assaults, you can sometimes count on losing almost your entire force on the roll of a single dice. That is much, much bloodier than other games I've played dealing with this subject. And I'm not sure whether I just had a rather fluky series of test games. I'm going to have to try that out. But I'm going to play this one to its conclusion. At the moment, it's the late December 1941 turn. And so the Japanese are still mostly stuck up in northern Malaya. The British resistance, particularly on the western coast, is proving a bit more stubborn than it did historically, and the Japanese will need reinforcements to press forward. So already it's becoming a bit ahistorical, but I'm going to plug on with it and see how I do. I hope that's given you a very, very brief idea of how the game works. It does seem fairly straightforward. The rulebook is not terribly clear in places, but I think a few plays in and everything should fall into place. The sequence of play, at any rate, is clearly laid out. Oh, and of course, there is the upside down, because it's on the Japanese player side, the victory point track. It is possible to win this game on points rather than occupying territory, but it is difficult to achieve because the Japanese have to score rather a lot of points in order to do this, and conversely the Commonwealth player has to force them into fairly high negative numbers to secure a win that way. So it's difficult. Far easier to claim and or lose real estate. I think that just about covers it. It is a fairly straightforward game. As I've said before, it is rather good looking too. So I'll see how we progress with this, get to the end of it, and come back to you soon with a final report. Thank you.